The cold Baltic wind howled across the frozen lake as the Teutonic Knights charged forward, their white mantles emblazoned with black crosses fluttering like spectral banners in the dawn light. It was the winter of 1242, and the ice beneath their horses' hooves trembled under the weight of armor and ambition. This was the Battle of Lake Peipus, where one of medieval Europe's most formidable warrior monks would meet their match against the forces of Novgorod. But who were these enigmatic knights, clad in Crusader garb yet carving out a kingdom far from the Holy Land? Their story begins in the shadow of the Third Crusade, a tale not just of conquest but of an order shrouded in myth, power, and a relentless drive to shape history. Imagine a brotherhood born in the fiery chaos of the Crusades, sworn to protect pilgrims but destined to forge an empire of their own. The Teutonic Knights emerged from the Siege of Acre in 1190, a small band of German knights answering the call to defend Christendom. Yet within decades, they would transform into something far more ambitious, a military order with its own territory, its own rules, and a hunger for expansion that rivaled kings. Their rise was meteoric, their methods ruthless. From the holy city of Jerusalem to the snowbound forests of Prussia, they wielded faith as a weapon, converting pagans at sword point and building castles that still stand as ghostly reminders of their reign. But every empire has its reckoning. Behind the gleaming armor and pious vows lay a web of intrigue, betrayal, and hubris. The Teutonic Knights didn't just fight battles, they waged wars of ideology, clashing with popes, princes, and even fellow crusaders. And when their ambition outstripped their reach, their downfall became as dramatic as their ascent. This is the story of how a band of warrior monks became the architects of their own undoing, leaving behind ruins, legends, and a legacy that still echoes across Europe. So grab your sword and shield, we're stepping into the world of blood, faith, and iron that defined the Teutonic Knights. The Siege of Acre in 1190 was a crucible of blood and desperation, a turning point not just for the Crusades but for a small group of German merchants who would change the course of European history. Amid the choking smoke and chaos of the Christian siege, these men erected a makeshift hospital from the sails of their ships, tending to wounded pilgrims with no thought of glory. Their humility caught the attention of the Crusader elite, and soon what began as a charitable brotherhood took its first steps toward becoming a military powerhouse. Pope Celestine III formally recognized their efforts in 1198, blessing them as the Order of the Teutonic Knights of St. Mary's Hospital in Jerusalem. But their mission was about to shift dramatically. Enter Hermann von Salza, a cunning diplomat and warrior who saw potential where others saw only monks in linen robes. Under his leadership, the order secured imperial favor from Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, a bond that would grant them lands, privileges, and a new purpose. No longer content with bandaging wounds, they began donning white cloaks over chainmail, their black crosses a stark declaration. They were now soldiers of God. Their early hospitals, humble shelters of wood and cloth, soon gave way to sprawling stone commanderies, part fortress, part monastery. These were not just places of healing but hubs of power, where knights took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, yet wielded swords with the precision of kings. The Teutonic Order's dual nature emerged, pious caretakers by doctrine, ruthless strategists by necessity. By the 1220s, they had outgrown their role as medical guardians, eyeing the pagan north as their divine battleground. The stage was set for a holy war unlike any other one that would stretch from the Mediterranean to the Baltic, leaving castles and legends in its wake. Pope Innocent III's seal pressed into the parchment in 1198, marking a turning point for the Teutonic Knights, an official blessing that transformed them from a loose band of caregivers into a sanctioned force of holy warriors. This wasn't just recognition, it was a divine mandate. The Pope's decree granted them the same privileges as the Templars and Hospitallers, but with a twist. these German knights were to be both monks and soldiers, a hybrid order cloaked in piety yet forged for battle. Their rulebook, penned by the Pope himself, demanded austerity, simple meals, coarse robes, and nights spent in prayer. Yet their armories brimmed with swords, their stables filled with war horses. This duality defined them. While other orders specialized medicine or combat, the Teutonics mastered both, weaving faith and force into a single unstoppable thread. Their first test came not in the Holy Land but in Transylvania, a frontier land where Christian kings and pagan tribes clashed. King Andrew II of Hungary invited the knights in 1211, offering them territory in exchange for defending his borders. Here, the order's true nature emerged. They built castles like Marienburg, towering fortresses that doubled as monasteries, where the clash of steel mingled with Gregorian chants. But their ambition soon unsettled the king. The knights didn't just defend, they expanded, carving out a state within a state, answering only to Rome. Within a decade, Andrew expelled them, fearing their growing power. Yet this setback revealed their genius. They weren't mercenaries but nation builders, turning exile into opportunity. Their early campaigns laid bare their strategy: convert or conquer, with little room for compromise. In Transylvania, they'd learned to wield faith as a weapon, offering pagans baptism or the blade. Now eyes turned north to Prussia, a land of dense forests and fierce tribes, where the order would plant its flag permanently. But their rise wasn't just military, it was bureaucratic. They created a network of commanderies, each a self-sufficient node of power, funneling wealth and recruits back to the Grand Master. By the 1230s, their influence stretched from the Mediterranean to the Baltic, a shadow empire fueled by papal favor and their uncanny ability to straddle two worlds, the spiritual and the sword. The Prussian wilderness was no place for the faint of heart, a land of endless bogs, towering oaks, and tribes who worshipped gods older than Christendom itself. When the Teutonic Knights marched north in 1230, they weren't just embarking on a crusade, they were engineering a wholesale transformation of the land. Their strategy was methodical, brutal, and breathtaking in its scale. First came the rivers, the lifeblood of Prussia, where they dragged barges laden with stone and timber, carving supply lines into the wilderness. Then rose the castles, thick-walled fortresses like Thorn and Culm, planted like iron teeth across the landscape. Each stronghold became a nucleus of control, radiating roads, mills, and converted villages. The knights didn't just conquer, they colonized, turning pagan soil into Christian territory one stone at a time. Their tactics were as pragmatic as they were ruthless. When diplomacy failed, and it often did, the order employed a grim calculus. Villages that resisted were razed, their leaders hanged as warnings. Those who surrendered faced a different fate: baptism at sword point, followed by crushing taxes and forced labor to build yet more castles. The chronicler Peter of Duisburg, writing decades later, described how the knights mimicked the pagans' own guerrilla tactics, launching winter campaigns when frozen rivers became highways and tribal warriors were scattered in their settlements. But their true innovation was demographic warfare. Alongside German knights came settlers, peasants, craftsmen, even criminals lured by land grants, swelling new towns like Elbing into bustling hubs. Over time, the very fabric of Prussia was rewoven, its old gods silenced under the weight of imported laws, languages, and liturgy. Yet the tribes didn't yield easily. Leaders like Hircus Monti, a Prussian chieftain trained in the knights' own tactics, turned their methods against them. In 1262, Monti's rebels sacked Marienwerder, slaughtering its garrison and burning the church where converts had been baptized. For over 50 years, revolts flared like wildfires, each crushed with escalating ferocity. By 1283, the knights had cemented their rule, but the cost was etched into the land: forests scorched, villages erased, and a people stripped of their gods. The Prussian Crusade wasn't just a war, it was the birth of a machine, a theocracy fueled by faith and steel, its heartbeat echoing from 100 fortress walls. And beyond those walls, a question lingered. How long could an empire built on blood and baptism hold? The Baltic Crusade pushed ever northward, and by 1237, the Teutonic Knights stood at a crossroads not just of geography but of destiny. That year, a rival order, the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, lay in ruins after a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Saul. Their remnants begged for salvation, and the Teutonics seized the moment. Pope Gregory IX brokered the merger, folding the Livonians into the Teutonic Order with a stroke of his quill. What seemed like an act of mercy was, in truth, a masterstroke of expansion. Overnight, the Knights inherited a vast network of forts and a simmering war against the last pagan holdouts of Livonia, modern-day Estonia and Latvia. Their white mantles now fluttered over Riga, the Baltic's greatest port, and with it, control of the trade routes that fed Europe's hunger for furs, wax, and amber. But Livonia was no passive prize. The land bristled with rebellion, its tribes united under leaders like Viestuds of Tervit, who knew every bog and thicket. The Knights adapted with chilling efficiency. They turned the brothers' old strongholds into hubs of a new campaign, launching winter raids when the snow masked their approach and frozen rivers became highways for their supply trains. By 1240, their grip tightened, but their greatest test loomed to the east. Novgorod. Its prince, Alexander Nevsky, had watched the Order's advance with growing alarm. When Teutonic forces crossed into Russian territory, seizing the fortress of Koporai, Nevsky struck back. The clash came on April 5, 1242, on the frozen skin of Lake Peipus. The Knights, confident in their heavy cavalry, charged across the ice, their lances gleaming. Nevsky's forces, a mix of Russian infantry and Mongol-influenced horse archers, feigned retreat, luring the Teutonics onto the weakest ice. As the weight of armored knights shattered the frozen surface, the lake became a tomb. Hundreds drowned, their bodies swallowed by the dark water. The battle on the ice wasn't just a defeat, it was a reckoning. For the first time, the Order's invincibility cracked, their expansion eastward halted. Yet even in setback, their ambition burned. Livonia remained theirs, a patchwork of castles and bishoprics where German merchants grew rich and native tribes bowed to the cross. By 1250, the Teutonic state reached its zenith, a realm spanning from Prussia to the Gulf of Finland, its grand master wielding power to rival kings. Their coinage circulated from Bruges to Novgorod, their envoys treated as princes in Rome and Constantinople. But empires built on conquest rarely rest easily. Behind the gilded facades of Riga's churches and the orderly rows of Hanseatic warehouses, resentment festered. The Livonian tribes nursed their grievances, and Nevsky's victory had shown the Order's rivals a fatal truth: even the mightiest knights could fall. The Teutonic Knights didn't just conquer Prussia, they built a machine. Their state was neither kingdom nor typical theocracy, but something entirely new, a hybrid of monastic discipline and military rule, where every acre of land, every loaf of bread, and every soul served the Order's grand design. At its heart lay a bureaucracy so precise it would make modern administrators blush. Each conquered territory was mapped, catalogued, and divided into commanderies, self-sufficient nodes of power where knights doubled as tax collectors, judges, and even urban planners. The Comte, or commander, of each district didn't just lead troops. He balanced ledgers, oversaw crop rotations, and enforced a legal code that blended canon law with Germanic customs. This wasn't chaos under a cross, it was cold, calculated efficiency. Trade became their silent weapon. By aligning with the Hanseatic League, the Knights transformed backwater Baltic ports into economic engines. Cities like Danzig flourished under their rule, its docks choked with grain, timber, and amber bound for Bruges and London. The Order took a cut of every transaction, funneling wealth back into their fortress monasteries. But their genius lay in incentives. Prussian peasants who embraced Christianity received lower taxes and protection from raids, while German settlers were lured with free land and exemption from feudal dues. Resistance meant ruined rebellious villages faced scorched earth and forced resettlement, but compliance offered a chance to prosper. The knights understood what many conquerors did not. Loyalty could be bought with bread as well as blood. Yet their true innovation was theocracy without priests. Unlike the papal states where bishops ruled, the Teutonic Order's leaders were warriors first. The Grand Master, elected by his brother knights, held power rivaling a pope's, issuing decrees, minting coins, and even negotiating treaties with foreign kings. Their capital at Marienburg wasn't just a fortress, it was a cathedral of statecraft, its scarlet brick walls enclosing scriptoria where scribes penned laws in flawless Latin. Even their failures revealed their ambition. When Lithuanian pagans resisted conversion, the knights turned crusading into a tourist industry, inviting nobles from across Europe to join seasonal campaigns, part holy war, part chivalric holiday complete with feasts and fabricated relics. The cost of this system was etched into the land. Prussian natives, though baptized, remained second-class citizens, barred from high office and heavy with tithes. The Order's chronicles boasted of progress, but buried in their archives are darker stories. Entire villages relocated to break tribal ties, forests burned to deny rebels shelter. By the 14th century, their state seemed unshakable, a Baltic colossus, but cracks were forming. The very trade networks that enriched them also bred resentment, as Hanseatic merchants chafed under knightly tariffs. And beyond the Order's borders, a new force was rising, a united Poland-Lithuania, whose kings would soon turn the knights' own tactics against them. The Teutonic machine had mastered the art of control, but empires built on calculated oppression rarely outlived their calculators. The gleaming spires of Marienburg cast long shadows across the Baltic, but by the late 1400s, the Teutonic Knights faced an enemy no fortress could withstand, a united front of Christian neighbors who had grown weary of their expansion. The seeds of conflict were sown not in battle, but in a royal wedding. In 1385, the Grand Duke of Lithuania, Jogaila, knelt before the fonts of Krakow's cathedral, converting to Christianity to marry Poland's young Queen Jadwiga. This union didn't just merge two crowns, it forged a political titan that would challenge the Order's very existence. Poland-Lithuania now stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, its rulers eyeing the Knights' territories with a mix of suspicion and hunger. For decades, the Order had justified its crusades by branding Lithuanians as pagans, but Jogaila's baptism shattered that pretext. Overnight, their holy war became a land grab in the eyes of Europe. Tensions simmered along the borders, skirmishes over trade routes, tithes withheld from knight-controlled bishoprics, and whispered alliances between Polish nobles and Prussian townsfolk chafing under Teutonic rule. The Knights retaliated with economic warfare, blocking Polish grain exports through Danzig, but each move only tightened the noose. By 1400, Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen found himself isolated, his order's reputation tarnished by accusations of greed and hypocrisy. Even the papacy, once their staunch ally, grew hesitant to endorse further campaigns. Then came the spark, a rebellion in Samojisha, a contested region between Prussia and Lithuania, gave the Knights an excuse to invade. They seized the fortress of Kovno in 1409, claiming it as a bulwark against heathen aggression. But Poland-Lithuania's king, W. Ladislaw Jagiello, was no longer the untested ruler they'd dismissed. With his cousin Vytautas at his side, he rallied an army unlike any Europe had seen, a mosaic of Polish knights, Lithuanian light cavalry, Tartar horse archers, and Bohemian mercenaries wielding cutting-edge gunpowder weapons. When the two forces clashed on July 15, 1410, near the village of Grunwald, the knights' legendary discipline met its match. Jagiello's forces lured the Teutonic heavy cavalry into a killing ground where Lithuanian feigned retreats and hidden trenches disrupted their formations. By dusk, von Jungingen lay dead, his banner trampled underfoot, and nearly 200 knightly brothers had joined him in the grave. the Order's sacred relics carried into battle for divine protection were paraded as trophies by the victors. Grunwald wasn't just a military defeat, it shattered the myth of Teutonic invincibility. Though Marienburg's walls held against the ensuing siege, the knights' aura of divine mandate had cracked. Their treasury drained, their prestige in tatters, they were forced into the humiliating Peace of Thorn, losing half their territories and crippling tributes. The battle marked the beginning of the end, proving that even the most formidable theocracies could bleed. Yet the Order's story wasn't over. Like a wounded beast, it would cling to power for another century, adapting, negotiating, and sometimes betraying its own ideals to survive in a changing world where faith alone could no longer justify empire. Dawn broke over Grunwald on July 15, 1410, but the Teutonic Knights hardly noticed the sunrise. A thick summer fog clung to the fields, muffling the clank of armor and the nervous whinnies of warhorses. Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen surveyed his forces, 27,000 men, including Europe's finest heavy cavalry, their white mantles stark against the gloom. Across the marshes, the combined might of Poland and Lithuania waited, their banners a riot of color against the mist. This wasn't just another battle, it was a collision of worlds. The knights had spent a century perfecting the art of holy war, but today their enemies fought not as pagans but as fellow Christians, an inconvenient truth that would unravel their righteous cause. The first charge came like thunder. Teutonic Knights, their lances tipped with the black crosses that had struck fear into Baltic tribes for generations, crashed into the Polish lines. For a moment, it seemed the old order would hold steel and discipline against numbers, but King W. Ladislaw Jagiello had studied his enemy too well. His Lithuanian cousin Vytautas unleashed a feigned retreat, drawing the overconfident knights into a deadly trap. As the heavy cavalry surged forward, they found themselves funneled between marshes where Polish infantry lay in wait, their pikes tearing into horseflesh. The fog, once an ally, now became a curse, masking the disaster unfolding on the flanks. Then came the moment that would echo through history. A stray lance found von Jungingen's throat, toppling the Grand Master from his saddle. His bodyguards fought like demons to recover him, but the tide had turned. Without their leader, the knights' famed discipline shattered. Polish knights surged forward, hacking at the white-cloaked warriors with grim determination. By afternoon, the field resembled a slaughterhouse, piles of dead horses, shattered lances, and the black crosses of fallen brothers trampled into the mud. The Order's sacred banner, said to hold fragments of the true cross, was ripped from its pole and paraded as a trophy. Grunwald wasn't just a defeat, it was an unraveling. For the first time, Europe saw the Teutonic Knights not as God's chosen warriors, but as mortal men bleeding in the dirt. Their aura of invincibility, carefully cultivated over 2 centuries, dissolved in a single day. The battle's aftermath was even more humiliating. Forced to sign the Peace of Thorn, the Order surrendered half their lands and paid reparations that drained their treasuries. Yet the true wound was spiritual. How could an order built on divine mandate explain such catastrophic failure? The answer, whispered in the taverns of Danzig and the courts of Rome, was simple. Their holy war had become indistinguishable from greed. The Teutonic machine still clanked on, but its gears were slipping, its purpose fading into the blood-stained soil of Grunwald. The ink on the Peace of Thorn hadn't even dried before the Teutonic Knights realized the full weight of their defeat. Signed in February 1411, the treaty wasn't just a setback. It was a seismic blow to everything the Order had built over 2 centuries. The terms read like a surrender penned by their worst enemies. Samogitia, the contested Baltic region that had sparked the war, was handed to Lithuania, stripping the knights of a strategic buffer zone. Worse still, Poland demanded reparations so staggering they amounted to 6 times the Order's annual income, 60,000 silver marks, a sum that would take decades to repay. To raise the funds, the brothers melted down sacred relics, pawned jeweled chalices, and levied crushing taxes on their already rebellious Prussian subjects. The financial strain was so severe that some commanderies resorted to selling grain reserves meant to feed their own troops, leaving garrisons half-starved in their own fortresses. But the true humiliation lay in the political concessions. For the first time, the Knights were forced to acknowledge Polish sovereignty over territories they'd long claimed as their own, a symbolic dagger to their divine mandate. Even their precious right to wage independent crusades was clipped. Future campaigns now required explicit approval from the Polish crown. The treaty's negotiators, sensing weakness, inserted clauses that allowed Prussian cities like Danzig to appeal directly to Poland if they felt oppressed by knightly rule, a loophole that would soon fuel fires of rebellion. Maps of the Teutonic state, once sprawling and confident, now looked like a jigsaw puzzle missing critical pieces. Back in Marienburg, the Order's leadership splintered under the weight of failure. Veteran knights who'd survived Grunwald blamed Grandmaster Heinrich von Plön, elected in desperation after von Jungengen's death, for agreeing to such crippling terms. His attempts to reform the Order's finances by slashing military budgets and selling off lands only deepened the resentment. By 1413, von Plön was deposed in a quiet coup, dragged from his chambers by his own brethren, and imprisoned in the very fortress he'd sworn to protect. His successors faced an impossible choice: default on reparations and risk another war, or bleed their territories dry to satisfy Poland. The Peace of Thorn exposed a fatal flaw in the Teutonic model. Their state had been built for eternal expansion, not contraction. Like a castle with no rear gate, they had no systems to manage defeat. Their economy, reliant on perpetual conquest and tribute, crumpled under the weight of peacetime debts. Prussian nobles and merchants, long stifled under knightly rule, saw their chance. Secret envoys began slipping across the border to Poland, offering intelligence and loyalty in exchange for promises of autonomy. The Knights still stood atop their scarlet brick battlements, but the ground beneath them was eroding, one grain of silver, one whispered betrayal at a time. Their aura of divine favor had been shattered, and in its place grew something far more dangerous: the realization among their subjects that the Order could be beaten. Resentment had been simmering in Prussia for decades, but in 1454 it finally boiled over. The Prussian Confederation, a secret alliance of nobles, merchants, and even disillusioned knights, sent a letter to Poland's King Casimir IV, not pleading for help but demanding it. Their grievances read like a bill of indictment against the Teutonic Order: crushing taxes, stifled trade, and the heavy-handed rule of foreign commanders who treated native Prussians as second-class subjects. When Casimir agreed to support their rebellion, the Confederation struck with precision. City gates swung open for Polish troops, and Teutonic garrisons found themselves besieged by their own people. Danzig, the Order's wealthiest port, became the epicenter of revolt, its burghers tearing down the Black Cross from the town hall and raising Poland's white eagle in its place. The Knights, already crippled by debt and dwindling recruits, faced a crisis unlike any before. This wasn't an external enemy at their gates, it was their own subjects, men who'd once paid their tithes and knelt in their chapels. Peasant uprisings erupted across the countryside, fueled by years of exploitation. In one brutal incident, villagers outside Marienburg burned their harvests rather than let the Order confiscate them, chanting, "Better ashes than your bread." The Knights retaliated with hangings and scorched earth tactics, but each reprisal only swelled the ranks of the rebellion. Even their legendary command structure began to fracture. Younger knights, questioning the Grand Master's leadership, whispered of negotiation, while hardliners advocated drowning the revolt in blood. By 1456, the conflict had devolved into a grinding war of attrition. The Order's once impressive treasury was empty, their mercenaries deserting over unpaid wages. Polish forces, sensing weakness, pushed deeper into Prussia, seizing castles with alarming ease. In a desperate gamble, Grand Master Ludwig von Ehrlichausen pledged allegiance to the Holy Roman Emperor, hoping for imperial intervention, but even that backfired. The emperor's tepid support alienated what little local sympathy remained, painting the knights as traitors to their own cause. The 13 Years' War, as it came to be known, exposed the fatal flaw in the Teutonic system. Their state had been built on conquest, not consent. They could force conversions and collect taxes, but without loyalty, their empire was a hollow shell. When the dust settled in 1466, the second piece of thorn carved Prussia in half. The western lands, including Danzig, became autonomous under Polish rule, while the knights retained only a rump state in the east. Their Grand Master, once a sovereign prince, was now a vassal, required to kneel before the Polish king in public homage. The message was clear: the age of unquestioned Teutonic dominance was over. What remained was a question not of how to rebuild, but whether the order could survive in a world that no longer feared its cross. The 13 Years' War didn't begin with a single battle. It started with a whisper in the taverns of Danzig. By 1454, Prussia had grown weary of the Teutonic Knights' iron grip. The Order's endless wars had bled the land dry, taxing merchants into poverty and conscripting farmers to fight battles they didn't believe in. When the Prussian Confederation, a coalition of nobles, burghers, and even low-born craftsmen, secretly swore oaths to overthrow their masters, they didn't just want reform. They wanted the knights gone. Their rebellion wasn't fought with pitchforks and torches, but with ledgers and treaties, the Confederation's first act. A formal appeal to Poland's King Casimir IV, offering him allegiance in exchange for liberation. Casimir, no stranger to the KNIGHT's Chinese letter, saw an opportunity too good to ignore. He declared war in March 1454, backing the rebels with Polish troops and a promise: Prussia would no longer be a theocratic fiefdom, but a land of free cities under the Polish crown. What followed wasn't a quick clash of armies, but a grinding, exhausting war of sieges and starvation. The knights, their treasury already emptied by Grunwald's reparations, scrambled to hire mercenaries, Bohemian pikemen, German artillerymen, even renegade Tatar horsemen. But mercenaries demanded gold, not holy vows, and the Order's coffers were dust. Commanders resorted to melting down church silver to pay their troops, pawning relics to Swiss bankers in a desperate bid for liquidity. The war's turning point came in 1457 at the Battle of Bornholm. A combined Polish-Prussian force ambushed a Teutonic relief column, capturing wagons loaded with the last of the Order's war chest, literally cutting off their lifeline. Without pay, mercenaries deserted en masse. Some even switched sides, selling the knights' battle plans to the highest bidder. By the early 1460s, the Order's grip had narrowed to a handful of starving fortresses. Marienburg itself, their mighty scarlet brick capital, fell not to assault, but to betrayal. A disgruntled garrison commander opened the gates to Polish forces in 1457, trading the fortress for a chest of silver and a royal pardon. When the second piece of thorn was signed in 1466, the terms were brutal. Western Prussia, including Danzig and its lucrative ports, became autonomous under Polish rule. The knights retained only the eastern rump of their state, and even that came with chains. Their Grand Master, now a vassal, had to kneel before King Casimir and swear fealty. The humiliation was theological as much as political. How could a holy order, once answerable only to God and the Pope, bow to a mortal king? The answer echoed in the silence of their abandoned chapels. Empires built on conquest rarely survived the day the conquered stopped believing in their invincibility. Prussia had been their masterpiece, but the very people they'd baptized and taxed had become the architects of their undoing. The knights still stood, but their cross now cast a shorter shadow. After the crushing defeat in Prussia, the Teutonic Knights clung to their last foothold, Livonia, a fractured land of marshes, pine forests, and restless German barons who resented taking orders from a dying order. Here, the knights reinvented themselves, trading holy war for political survival. By the 1550s, their Grand Master Wilhelm von Fürstenberg ruled from Riga's crumbling bishop's palace, his authority propped up by shaky alliances with local bishops and mercenary captains. The old zeal was gone. Livonian knights now spent less time praying over relics and more time haggling with Hanseatic merchants over tolls, their white mantles frayed symbols of a fading era. Then came the storm from the east. Ivan IV of Russia history would remember him as the Terrible, cast his gaze toward Livonia in 1558. His pretext was flimsy, unpaid tributes from Dorpat, a border town, but his goal was monstrously clear. Ivan wanted ice-free Baltic ports, and Livonia, weak and divided, stood in his way. The knights, outnumbered and outgunned, scrambled for allies. They turned first to Poland-Lithuania, the very power that had broken them at Grunwald, offering vassalage in exchange for protection. King Sigismund August hesitated. Supporting the knights meant war with Moscow, but abandoning them would hand Ivan the keys to the Baltic. The Livonian War that followed was less a clash of empires than a feeding frenzy. Swedish forces landed in the north, Danish mercenaries prowled the coasts, and Polish hussars carved through Russian lines. All while Ivan's oprichniki, his black-clad death squads, burned monasteries and impaled knights on stakes. The Order's last stand came at Wenden in 1578, where a tiny garrison of brothers held the castle against overwhelming Muscovite forces. When the walls fell, the survivors chose mass suicide over capture, blowing themselves up in the gunpowder storeroom. Their sacrifice bought nothing. By 1583, the war ended with Livonia in ruins. The knights, stripped of their lands and relevance, were formally dissolved in the region. Their remnants scattered, some joining the Polish army, others fading into obscurity as minor nobles. The once mighty order, which had baptized pagans at sword point and built an empire on Baltic ice, now existed only on paper. Yet even in defeat, their legacy endured. The castles they razed still stood, their walls now housing Polish garrisons or Swedish governors. The Teutonic Knights had vanished from Livonia, but the bones of their ambition remained, half buried in the muddy shores of a sea they once claimed as their own. The year 1525 marked not just a change of address for the Teutonic Knights, but an existential transformation. Homeless after losing Prussia and bleeding territory in Livonia, the Order packed its relics and archives into ox carts and rumbled south to Vienna, a city far from the Baltic mists where their legend had been forged. Their new master, Grand Master Albert of Brandenburg, wasn't some battle-scarred zealot, but a shrewd political operator from one of Europe's most powerful dynasties. His decision to secularize the Order sent shockwaves through Christendom. At a stroke, the brothers shed their monastic vows, trading white mantles for the polished breastplates of Habsburg servicemen. The papal excommunication that followed felt almost anticlimactic after centuries of holy war. The Knights had become just another mercenary company, their divine mandate swapped for Habsburg paymasters. Yet this wasn't just surrender, it was reinvention. The Order's new home in Vienna's Singerstrasse became a nerve center for the Habsburgs' eastern defenses. Their expertise in frontier warfare, honed against Lithuanian pagans and Russian armies, now served a different empire. The knights who once baptized Prussians at sword point found themselves garrisoning Croatian fortresses against Ottoman incursions, their black cross banners fluttering alongside the double-headed eagles of the Holy Roman Empire. Grand Master Walter von Kronberg, Albert's successor, formalized this arrangement in 1527, signing the Treaty of Krakow that made the Order permanent vassals to the Habsburgs. The document was a masterpiece of face-saving officially. They remained a spiritual order, but everyone knew the truth. The irony was delicious. The Habsburgs, who'd once eyed the Knights' Baltic ambitions with suspicion, now prized their institutional knowledge. Vienna's war councils leaned heavily on Teutonic veterans to interpret Ottoman tactics. their experience in Livonia proving unexpectedly useful against Turkish Sipahi cavalry. By 1545, when Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent besieged Vienna, it was former knights who trained the city's militia in anti-cavalry stakes techniques first developed against Lithuanian horsemen. The order even retained a shadow of its old recruiting networks, funneling German nobles into Habsburg service under the veneer of chivalric tradition. But the soul of the Brotherhood had undeniably changed. Gone were the days of conquering pagans in God's name now. They guarded supply convoys and inspected border forts. Their grandmasters became Habsburg courtiers, more likely to debate taxation than theology. The Singerstrasse compound, with its austere chapel and gleaming armory, stood as a museum of faded glory. Yet in one respect, the knights outlasted their critics. While the Templars had been crushed and the Hospitallers exiled to Malta, the Teutonic Order endured not as conquerors but as survivors. Their cross, once stamped onto maps of Prussia, now adorned payroll ledgers in Vienna's war office. Somewhere between the Baltic ice and the Danube's waters, they'd learned the hardest lesson of all: adaptation is the only eternity. The drums of revolution had been pounding across Europe for decades when Napoleon Bonaparte finally turned his gaze toward the Teutonic Knights in 1809. By then, the order was a shadow of its former self, a handful of aging brothers clinging to ceremonial titles and a few scattered properties in Austria. But to Napoleon, they represented everything he sought to erase: the old feudal order, the tangled web of church and state, the stubborn remnants of medieval privilege. His decree that August was as brutal as it was brief. The Teutonic Order, 800 years after its founding, was formally dissolved, its remaining lands seized, its archives tossed into French administrative warehouses. The knights who had once terrified pagans and kings alike were now pensioners, their white mantles packed away in chests, their swords melted down for scrap metal. Yet Napoleon underestimated the order's most enduring trait: its uncanny ability to survive extinction. The Habsburgs, longtime patrons of the knights, saw an opportunity in the chaos. Emperor Francis II quietly reassembled the order's remnants in 1834, stripping away its military past and rebranding it as a purely charitable institution. No longer would they wage holy wars now, they ran hospitals and orphanages, their black crosses stitched onto nurses' aprons instead of battle standards. The transformation was startling but strategic. In an age of nationalism and revolutions, a crusading order was an anachronism but a Catholic charity. That had purpose. The order's revival was more than symbolic. It was a masterclass in reinvention. Their new Grand Master, Archduke Maximilian of Austria-Est, wasn't a warrior but a philanthropist, funneling Habsburg wealth into schools and leper colonies. The knights' medieval commanderies became clinics, their armories converted into soup kitchens. Even their language changed. Latin chronicles of pagan conversions gave way to German ledgers tracking vaccination rates and bed counts. By the late 19th century, they operated some of Austria's most modern hospitals, their reputation for mercy slowly eclipsing memories of Baltic conquests. But the ghosts of their past lingered. When Prussia unified Germany in 1871, Otto von Bismarck, no friend to Catholic orders, barred the Teutonic Knights from setting foot in their ancestral homeland. The irony was palpable. The very lands they had baptized and ruled now rejected them, their names scrubbed from Prussian history books. Yet in Vienna, the order endured, a living relic adapting to every upheaval. World War I shattered the Habsburg Empire, but the Knights survived, their hospitals treating wounded from both sides. When Nazi Germany annexed Austria in 1938, they dodged dissolution again by emphasizing their medical work. Though Hitler's regime viewed them with suspicion, their cross too reminiscent of the Crusades he sought to emulate. Through it all, the Teutonic Knights clung to one unshakable truth: survival wasn't about glory but utility. They had entered the 20th century not as conquerors, but as healers, their legacy measured in lives saved rather than territories won. The boy who once dreamed of charging into battle with sword and cross now aspired to don a surgeon's smock. Their empire had crumbled, but their name endured, no longer a sword of Christendom, but a scalpel in its service. The Black Cross still flies today, though you're more likely to find it stitched onto a nurse's uniform than emblazoned on a crusader's shield. The Teutonic Order's modern revival is one of history's great ironies, a brotherhood born in bloodshed now running hospitals and soup kitchens across Europe. After Napoleon's dissolution, the Habsburgs quietly resurrected them in 1834, but with a twist. Gone were the swords and sieges, replaced by bedpans and bandages. Their Grand Master became an archduke in a charitable enterprise, their knights swapping chainmail for scrubs. In Vienna's Singerstrasse, where once they planned Baltic conquests, they now coordinate disaster relief, their medieval commanderies retrofitted as clinics for the poor. Yet the ghosts of Prussia linger. In modern Germany and Poland, the Order's legacy remains contentious. School textbooks debate whether they were brutal colonizers or civilizing forces, with statues of knights torn down in some towns and restored in others. Even their humanitarian work can't escape the shadow of the past. When the Order donated medical equipment to Polish hospitals in the 1990s, protests erupted. Survivors of World War II recalling how Nazis had appropriated the Teutonic Cross as a symbol of their own expansionist dreams. The knights today walk a tightrope, their medieval history both a burden and a branding opportunity. Their survival hinges on duality. In Germany, they emphasize their 900 years of continuous service, downplaying the Crusades. In Austria, they partner with the Catholic Church on refugee resettlement, their medieval network of commanderies proving oddly effective for modern logistics. Even their rituals have adapted. New initiates still take vows of obedience, but instead of swearing to conquer pagans, they pledge to serve the sick without regard for creed. The ceremony happens not in a candlelit chapel, but often in a hospital ward, the white mantle placed over their shoulders as monitors beep in the background. The greatest testament to their endurance, they've outlived every empire that tried to destroy them. The Habsburgs collapsed, the Soviets buried Prussia under concrete, yet the Order persists not as conquerors, but as guardians of the very people their ancestors once subjugated. Their castles may lie in ruins, but their legacy is written in quieter places. The orphanages of Sicily, the mobile clinics of Ukraine, the archives where medieval charters sit beside modern vaccination records. The Teutonic Knights no longer wield swords, but their cross endures, a reminder that even the fiercest warriors can, against all odds, learn the art of peace. The image of the Teutonic Knights as mindless brutes, crusading through the Baltic with nothing but bloodlust and zeal, is a caricature that crumbles under scrutiny. Popular culture loves the trope of the fanatical warrior monk, sword in one hand, Bible in the other, but the reality was far more nuanced. Take their legal system, for instance. Excavations at Malbork Castle revealed not just armories, but meticulously kept court records. The knights didn't just rule by the sword, they codified laws in painstaking detail, from property disputes to fair trade practices. A Prussian peasant could appeal an unjust tax levied to the Order's magistrates, and surviving documents show these cases were often decided in the plaintiff's favor. This wasn't the whim of warlords, it was governance with parchment and seal. Their cultural footprint tells a similar story. While chroniclers like Peter of Duisburg painted their campaigns in stark terms of good versus evil, the archaeology of Teutonic castles whispers of synthesis, not suppression. At Königsberg, the Order's great stronghold, traces of pagan Prussian craftsmanship appear in the very bricks local artisans employed to build Christian chapels, their traditional patterns subtly woven into the stonework. Even their famed brutality had limits. When pagan tribes surrendered, the knights often allowed them to retain local leaders and customs, so long as tithes flowed and crosses stood in place of sacred groves. Compare this to contemporaries like the Mongols, who razed cities wholesale, and the Teutonic approach seems almost pragmatic. The myth of their indiscriminate violence also ignores their role as Europe's early urban planners. Cities like Elbing and Thorn weren't just military outposts, they were hubs of commerce and learning, laid out with grid-patterned streets, public baths, and even piped water systems centuries before such luxuries reached Paris or London. The Order's ledgers show investments in schools, not just siege engines, and their libraries held medical treatises alongside military manuals. A knight might spend his morning drilling with a mace and his afternoon debating Aristotle with visiting scholars. Yet the darkest accusations aren't entirely baseless. Massacres like the slaughter at Christmamel in 1283, where a surrendered Prussian garrison was executed despite promises of mercy, stain their record. But these weren't the norm. They were strategic terror, calculated to break resistance when diplomacy failed. The knights understood the power of fear, but also the value of stability. Their state lasted because it offered something rare in medieval Europe: order. Roads patrolled, contracts honored, heresy punished, all under the watchful eyes of men who saw themselves not as conquerors, but as shepherds of a flock they were sworn to protect, even if that protection came at the edge of a sword. Perhaps the most telling contradiction lies in their own ranks. The Teutonic rule demanded monks live in poverty, yet commanders presided over banquets served on silver plate. They took vows of chastity, yet their castles housed workshops producing exquisite jewelry, gifts for allies, or secret tokens for lovers. The Order was a mirror of medieval Europe itself, pious and profane, brutal and bureaucratic, a paradox in white cloaks and black crosses. To reduce them to mere barbarians is to miss the forest for the blood-stained trees. Their legacy isn't written in blood alone, but in the very blueprint of how faith and power intertwined in the shaping of a continent. The Teutonic Knights didn't just conquer Prussia, they built in brick and blood, leaving behind fortresses so colossal they seemed to defy the very laws of medieval engineering. At the heart of their architectural legacy stood Malbork, the world's largest brick castle, a sprawling complex so vast it could house an entire army within its crimson walls. Constructed over 4 decades starting in 1274, this fortress wasn't just a military stronghold, it was a carefully engineered statement of power. The knights imported Flemish bricklayers to achieve near-perfect symmetry, their Gothic arches and ribbed vaults echoing the great cathedrals of France, yet adapted for warfare. Every detail served dual purposes. Soaring windows flooded chapels with light but also doubled as archers' loopholes, while ornate ceramic tiles underfoot bore the Order's cross, a constant reminder of who ruled here. But Malbork was more than just walls and weaponry. Its courtyards buzzed with merchants from Lubeck and Novgorod, trading amber and grain in shadows cast by defensive towers. The knights transformed their castles into economic engines, with breweries, bakeries, and even mints operating within fortified walls. At Thorn Castle, archaeologists uncovered ledgers showing transactions in silver, furs, and even Baltic timber, proof that these were bustling marketplaces as much as military hubs. The Order's genius lay in integration. A single complex might house a chapel, an armory, a granary, and a hospital, all interconnected by vaulted passageways designed for both ceremony and siege. Their architectural innovations spread far beyond Prussia. The knights pioneered the use of defensive galleries covered walkways along curtain walls where crossbowmen could rain death on attackers while remaining shielded. At Königsberg, they engineered a revolutionary system of concentric defenses, with multiple layers of walls forcing invaders into deadly choke points. Even their choice of material was strategic. Unlike stone castles of Western Europe, their red brick fortresses used locally sourced clay, baked in on-site kilns, a move that cut costs and accelerated construction. When winter froze the Baltic, these dark crimson walls stood stark against the snow, a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. yet perhaps their most enduring legacy was the fusion of sacred and secular spaces. Malbork's high castle featured a chapel with a star-painted ceiling, its acoustics designed to amplify Gregorian chants, but directly beneath it lay the Grand Master's treasury, where gold flowed as steadily as prayers. This duality defined Teutonic architecture: murder holes disguised as decorative tracery, scriptoriums where monks copied scripture just floors above armories stockpiling Greek fire. Their castles weren't just buildings, they were physical manifestos of an order that saw no contradiction between piety and power, between the sword and the sacristy. Even in ruin, these red brick giants whisper of an empire that shaped its world one meticulously laid brick at a time. Beneath the white mantles and polished armor, the Teutonic Knights guarded secrets that transcended the battlefield. Their initiation rites, conducted in torchlit chambers of castles like Marienburg, were ceremonies of transformation where ordinary men became brothers of the sword. New recruits endured nights of fasting and prayer, their vows sealed not just with ink but with blood. A chronicle from 1289 describes the ritual. The candidate knelt barefoot on cold stone, a sword pressed to his throat as he swore lifelong obedience to the Grand Master. The final act was the cloaking a white mantle emblazoned with the black cross draped over his shoulders, symbolizing the death of his former life. This wasn't mere theater, it was psychological alchemy, forging individual knights into a single, unbreakable entity. The Black Cross itself held layers of hidden meaning. Unlike the Templars' red cross or the Hospitallers' white, the Teutonic emblem, a stark, broad-limbed cross against pure white, was designed for instant recognition on the battlefield. But its symbolism ran deeper. Some scholars argue its form echoed the Iron Cross used in Germanic pagan rites, a deliberate appropriation to unsettled Baltic tribes. Others point to its resemblance to the cross potent, a medieval symbol of spiritual authority. By the 1400s, the Order's cross had evolved into the cross patée, its flared arms resembling swords, a subtle nod to their dual identity as monks and warriors. This iconography would later resurface in Prussian military decorations and even influence the Iron Cross of 19th-century Germany. Whispers of the Knights' secret knowledge persisted long after their decline. Renaissance occultists claimed they preserved ancient texts in cipher, hidden beneath castle flagstones. When Freemasonry emerged in the 1700s, its rituals bore curious parallels: initiation by sword point, symbolic cloaking, and architectural metaphors mirroring the Knights' famed castle building. While no direct lineage has been proven, Masonic lodges in Prussia and Austria eagerly adopted Teutonic imagery. The Strict Observance faction, an 18th-century Masonic branch, even claimed descent from the Order's lost initiates, weaving elaborate myths around Marienburg's vaults. Historians dismiss this as romantic fabrication, but the fascination endures. Modern esoteric groups still study the night ceremonies, searching for echoes of a hidden tradition. Perhaps the most tantalizing mystery lies in the Ritterbruder, the inner circle of knights who allegedly guarded the Order's deepest secrets. Fragmentary accounts describe a ritual known as Die Schwarze-Kapelle, the Black Chapel, where senior brothers convened in a windowless chamber to debate matters not fit for parchment. Some speculate these meetings involved forbidden knowledge, copies of Aristotle's lost works smuggled from Constantinople, or alchemical formulas passed down from Arab scholars. The truth may be simpler, yet no less intriguing. In an age of absolute faith, the Teutonic Knights understood the power of mystery. Their symbols and rites weren't just tools of cohesion, but psychological warfare, a way to appear invincible even to themselves. When a Prussian convert confronted a knight about rumors of occult practices, the brother reportedly smiled and tapped his black cross. All secrets are here. Few are worthy to see. That paradox, a monastic order drenched in blood yet whispering of hidden truths, ensured their legend would outlast their empire. Beneath the clatter of swords and the clink of Crusader armor, an entire sisterhood worked in silence, the Sisters of the Teutonic Order. While chroniclers fixated on battlefields, these women shaped history from the shadows, stitching wounds, managing supply lines, and running infirmaries with a precision that kept the Order's war machine grinding forward. Their existence defies the stereotype of the Teutonic Knights as a boys' club of holy warriors. Records from 1284 reveal a bustling commandery in Königsberg where Sister Margaret von Passau oversaw not just a hospital but an entire network of granaries and bakeries, feeding garrisons and refugees alike. Her ledgers, preserved in cracked vellum, list everything from barley stores to the linen bandages woven by nuns in the cloister, a proof that every crusader's sword swing was enabled by a dozen quiet acts of female labor. The sisters' role was no afterthought. From their founding in 1226, the Order's rulebook carved out explicit space for women. They took identical vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but their battlefield was the sick. At Acre, Sister Sophia of Tyre famously turned a bombarded chapel into a triage center during the siege of 1291, her team pulling knights from rubble and stanching wounds with vinegar-soaked rags. Their hospitals weren't primitive huts but cutting-edge facilities for the era. Sister Hedwig's infirmary in Marienwerder boasted separate wards for contagious diseases, a rarity in medieval Europe. Yet their influence stretched beyond medicine. When supply caravans bogged down in Prussian mud, it was Sister Ida of Elbing who negotiated with local farmers for fresh oxen. Her fluency in Old Prussian bridging cultural divides male knights often inflamed. Commanders relied on these women as diplomats, healers, and logisticians, roles requiring literacy in Latin and German, mastery of herb lore, and the administrative savvy to balance ledgers down to the last penny. One surviving letter from Grand Master Winrich von Niprode in 1367 begs the Riga convent to send more sisters, praising their unerring hands and sharper wits than any quartermaster. The sisters' legacy crumbles the myth of passive medieval womanhood. At Red Den Convent, excavations revealed not just rosaries but iron keys to storeroom, symbols of real authority. Their herbal gardens grew antiseptic sage and pain-killing henbane. Their kitchens brewed medicinal beers. When plague ravaged Livonia in 1350, Sister Katharina of Dorpat's quarantine protocols saved hundreds, a feat later misattributed to male clergy. Suppressed narratives resurface in fragments. A 1293 papal bull scolding knights for letting sisters overstep, or the defiant graffiti in Thorn Castle's cellar, a nun's hand carving the Teutonic cross beside the word sign Nobis Nihil, without us nothing. By the 1400s, as the Order's military fortunes waned, the sisters faced escalating restrictions. Church authorities, unnerved by their autonomy, pressured them into stricter enclosure. Yet even diminished, their impact lingered. The ghostly echo of their work survives in modern nursing orders, in the Baltic folk songs still sung about the white-clad healers, and in the overlooked archives where women's hands penned the orders that held a theocracy together. The Teutonic state didn't just rise on the swords of men, it was sutured by the hands of women. Rumors of the Teutonic Knights' hidden treasures have swirled for centuries, whispers of vaults overflowing with Baltic amber, sacred relics pillaged from Byzantium, and chests of gold melted down from pagan idols. Their castles, built to intimidate, also served as treasure houses for loot gathered across Europe and the Holy Land. In the crypts of Marienburg, chronicles speak of a chamber called Der Bernstein round the amber room where raw nuggets the size of goose eggs were stacked like firewood. Baltic amber, then worth more than silver by weight, flowed into the Order's coffers as tribute from conquered Prussian tribes. Some was carved into rosaries for bishops, while the finest pieces were shipped to Venice in exchange for Italian armor. But after the fall of Prussia, the amber vanished. Did it fund their exile in Livonia? Was it buried beneath Königsberg's ruins, or did Polish looters smuggle it south after Grunwald? The truth remains as opaque as the golden resin itself. Their appetite for sacred relics bordered on obsession. During the sack of Constantinople in 1204, Teutonic Knights allegedly seized a dozen crates of holy artifacts, fragments of the true cross, St. George's finger bone, even the crown of thorns later sold to Louis IX of France. These weren't just spiritual trophies, they were political leverage. Displaying a saint's relic in a fortress chapel could attract pilgrims and their donations while justifying further crusades. But the order's relic collection had darker chapters. In 1281, a scandal erupted when a papal legate accused them of forging miracles with counterfeit bones. A chest supposedly holding St. Barbara's skull was found filled with deer teeth, wrapped in silk to mimic sanctity. Whether deception or mix-up, the incident revealed the ruthless pragmatism beneath their piety. The fate of their archives is perhaps the greatest mystery. For centuries, the order's commanderies kept meticulous records, land deeds, trial transcripts, even encrypted correspondence with popes. These documents didn't just chronicle battles, they held secrets which Prussian nobles had secretly negotiated with Lithuanian pagans, which bishops took bribes to overlook the knights' excesses. When the Soviets stormed Königsberg in 1945, they discovered the order's surviving archives in the castle cellars, only for the collection to vanish en route to Moscow. A Red Army officer's diary mentions 12 iron chests loaded onto a train that never arrived. Some scholars believe Stalin's agents destroyed them to erase evidence of German medieval claims to the region. Others whisper that a portion survived, smuggled out by a Lithuanian archivist who recognized their worth. The most tantalizing clue surfaced in 1992 when a dealer in Vienna auctioned a 13th-century Teutonic ledger, its margins filled with cryptic symbols. Carbon dating confirmed its authenticity, but the text defied translation. Was it a cipher, a treasure map, or merely an overzealous scribe's doodles? The truth may lie buried in the rubble of Marienburg's collapsed east wing, where ground-penetrating radar recently detected hollow chambers beneath the foundations. Until excavations begin, the Knights' greatest secrets remain locked in the earth, waiting for the shovels of the curious to uncover what 700 years of history have kept hidden. The winter of 1456 was supposed to be quiet at Marienburg Castle, the Teutonic Knights' once mighty stronghold, now a shadow of its former glory. Crushing debts from the 13 Years' War had reduced the order to pawning tapestries and melting down altar silver, but the real treasure lay in the vault beneath the high castle. Chests of gold florins, sacks of Baltic amber, and the sacred relics that had once justified their holy wars. No one expected a lone mercenary to walk out with it all. Hans von Köln wasn't some master thief, just a disgruntled artillery captain whose pay was 6 months overdue. But on the night of February 12th, as blizzards howled off the Nogat River, he pulled off one of history's boldest heists. The scheme was shockingly simple. Köln had spent months memorizing guard rotations, bribing a sentry with promises of stolen wine, and, most crucially, learning the vault's one weakness. Unlike the castle's fortifications, its treasury door relied on an ancient wooden lock, its mechanism worn smooth by generations of careless turnkeys. With a forged key and a diversion, a fire set in the stables, Köln slipped into the vault while the garrison scrambled. What he took remains debated. Chronicles mention 9 chests of gold, the order's charters, and the famed White Mantle of Acre, a relic said to have healing powers. But Köln's real prize might have been the Bernsteinkammer ledger, a coded inventory of the Knights' hidden amber stockpiles across Prussia. The aftermath was chaos. Grandmaster Ludwig von Ehrlichausen ordered the castle searched floor to ceiling, even draining the well in case Köln had dumped evidence. Interrogations revealed a network of accomplices, a scribe who altered guard logs, a cook who smuggled rope out in bread baskets. Yet Köln himself vanished as if swallowed by the snow. Some claimed he fled to Danzig, bribing his way onto a Hanseatic cargo ship. others whispered he'd been caught and executed, his body buried in an unmarked ditch to avoid scandal. The only certainty, the treasure never resurfaced. Theories about its fate still tantalize historians. Baltic fishermen tell of amber washing ashore near the Vistula Delta, its raw edges too neatly cut to be natural. In 1889, a Danzig bricklayer stumbled on a rotting chest filled with German coins dated before 1450, but the city authorities confiscated it before scholars could inspect. The most intriguing clue surfaced in 1937, when Polish workers renovating Malbork's chapel pried up a floor tile and found a single gold florin stamped with the Order's cross. Was it dropped in Köln's haste, a taunt left behind, or proof the mercenary never left at all? The vault's emptiness haunted the knights until their downfall. Without funds to pay mercenaries or bribe allies, their grip on Prussia unraveled within a decade. Köln's heist didn't just steal gold, it stole the Order's last chance at survival. The Black Cross of the Teutonic Knights has been resurrected far beyond medieval chronicles, stamped onto everything from video game banners to the iron crosses of Nazi uniforms, each reinterpretation twisting their legacy into new shapes. In the strategy game Crusader Kings, players command the Order as holy conquerors, their pixelated armies spreading across a digitized Baltic. But the game's mechanics reveal a subtle truth the knights themselves understood: faith and force are currencies in the same economy. Raise taxes too high and even devout subjects rebel. Execute too many prisoners and allies question your righteousness. It's a sanitized echo of the Order's real-world calculus where piety and pragmatism walked hand in blood-stained gauntlets. Far darker was the Nazi obsession with Teutonic imagery. Heinrich Himmler, architect of the Holocaust, idolized the Knights as proto-fascists, their crusades a blueprint for his vision of German expansion. He reframed their Baltic campaigns as a racial struggle, ignoring the Order's actual multicultural makeup: Lithuanian auxiliaries, Prussian converts, even Tatar mercenaries. At Wewelsburg Castle, Himmler's SS shrine, a stolen Teutonic relic, a sword said to belong to Grand Master Winrich von Niprode, was displayed like a sacred totem. The irony was grotesque. An order founded to protect pilgrims became propaganda for genocide. Even cinema can't resist romanticizing them. Sergei Eisenstein's Alexander Nevsky painted the knights as faceless invaders, their horned helmets a Soviet-era myth. Yet the film's chilling battle on the ice sequence, with knights drowning under cracked ice, borrowed more from opera than history. Contrast this with Kazajscy, Poland's blockbuster adaptation of Teutonic Wars, where the knights are nuanced antagonists, brutal but devout, their castles gleaming with Gothic splendor. Both versions distort, but together they reveal a tension. Were the knights monsters or missionaries? The answer shifts with the storyteller's agenda. Modern far-right groups still misappropriate their symbols, stitching black crosses onto banners at rallies from Warsaw to Charlottesville. Yet in Marienburg's rebuilt halls, tour guides emphasize the Order's hospitals, not their swords. Their legacy is a Rorschach test, seen as imperialists by some, as civilizing forces by others. The truth, as always, lies buried in the middle. A brotherhood capable of both nurturing the sick and burning the defiant, their history too complex for any single narrative to contain. Beneath the manicured lawns of modern Poland, the earth still holds grim testimony to the Teutonic Knights' conquest. In 2018, construction workers near Grunwald stumbled upon a mass grave, not from the famous battle, but from the lesser-known Prussian uprisings of the 1260s. The skeletons told a harrowing story. Forensic analysis revealed execution-style blows to the back of skulls, the bones of children intermingled with warriors, their limbs broken post-mortem in what archaeologists call overkill violence, a deliberate message of terror. This wasn't just warfare, it was psychological domination etched into bone. The Knights' Chronicles boasted of pacifying Prussia, but these graves whisper the darker truth behind their civilizing mission. Ground-penetrating radar has since uncovered similar sites across the Baltic burial pits where the dead were dumped with pagan amulets still clutched in their hands, suggesting forced conversions followed by mass executions. At one site near Elblag, researchers found arrowheads embedded in vertebrae at close range, evidence of prisoners executed against castle walls. But the most chilling discovery came from isotopic analysis of teeth enamel. By studying chemical traces, scientists traced some victims' origins hundreds of miles east, proof the knights enslaved captives from distant raids, marching them back to Prussia as human spoils of war. Technology is also rewriting the knights' architectural legacy. LiDAR scans of the Chelmno region revealed an eerie gridwork beneath the forest, the ghostly outlines of long-lost villages and field systems arranged with military precision. The Order didn't just conquer, they engineered entire landscapes, rerouting rivers to power mills and flattening sacred groves for wheat monoculture. At Malbork, thermal imaging exposed hidden passages where scribes may have kept double ledgers, one for papal inspectors, another recording the true toll of tribute extracted from Prussian serfs. Perhaps the most surprising finds challenge old stereotypes. DNA analysis from graves in Marienburg's infirmary showed Baltic and even Tatar ancestry among the knights themselves, suggesting the Order was less a pure Germanic force than a melting pot of crusaders, converts, and mercenaries. In Riga's St. George's Church, a fresco once thought to depict St. George was recently re-identified through pigment analysis as a Teutonic commander. His face deliberately scrubbed out during the Reformation, a palimpsest of shifting power. These discoveries peel back layers of propaganda from both sides. The knights weren't mindless butchers, their violence was calculated, systematic, and often meticulously recorded. Nor were their victims passive savages. Tooth-wear patterns show Prussian warriors consumed just as much meat and mead as their conquerors, their societies far more complex than Crusader chronicles admitted. Archaeology doesn't just uncover the past, it forces us to confront the messy reality behind the myths, where heroism and horror often wear the same white cloak. The Teutonic Knights' collapse wasn't a single dramatic event. It was death by 1,000 cuts, each self-inflicted. Their downfall offers a masterclass in the dangers of overreach, a cautionary tale etched not just in medieval chronicles but in the playbooks of modern empires. Like the Romans stretching legions too thin or the British Empire buckling under colonial rebellions, the knights mistook conquest for control. Their Baltic territories sprawled across landscapes they couldn't culturally digest, peppered with castles but starved of loyal hearts. Sound familiar? Modern parallels whisper from headlines, nations pouring trillions into foreign interventions only to face insurgencies that outlast their political will. The knights' fatal error wasn't winning battles, it was failing to win the peace, a lesson some superpowers still grapple with today. Corruption slithered into their ranks like rot in a fortress's beams. As their empire peaked, commanders grew fat on Baltic grain profits, hoarding wealth meant for garrisons. The Ryzen, those chivalric, seasonal crusades for European nobles, devolved into lavish tourist traps, knights jousting for applause while Prussian serfs starved. Their sacred vows of poverty became a sick joke. Grandmasters dined on peacock while conscripts mutinied over moldy bread. This wasn't just hypocrisy, it was systemic decay. When local revolts erupted, the Order's response was telling. They hired more mercenaries instead of addressing grievances. Compare that to modern states where elites skim infrastructure funds until bridges collapse, or corporations prioritize shareholder dividends over worker wages. The pattern is ancient power unchecked by accountability breeds its own rebellion. The knights' blind spot, they never evolved their founding myth. In the 1200s, branding Prussians as pagans justified conquest. By 1400, Lithuania had been Christian for decades, yet the Order kept drumming up crusades to milk European donations. Their rhetoric fossilized while reality moved on, leaving them stranded in a lie. Today's parallels are stark nations invoking Cold War ideologies in multipolar worlds, or industries clinging to obsolete models while disruptors eat their lunch. The Knights' real enemy wasn't Poland or rebellious peasants, it was their inability to adapt their story. Their final lesson is the cruelest: no empire falls solely from external blows. The Polish-Lithuanian Union didn't destroy them, it exposed fissures that were already there. Crushing taxes turned Prussian cities into fifth columnists. Ruthless conscription emptied villages of young men who might have defended them. Even their famed discipline-cracked letters reveal knights gambling with dice carved from communion wafers. Modern parallels: superpowers investing in aircraft carriers while schools crumble, or fossil fuel giants doubling down on oil as the climate boils. The Teutonic state didn't collapse because it was weak, it collapsed because it refused to see its own fragility until the ice cracked beneath its feet. Perhaps the most haunting legacy is how their symbols outlived their wisdom. The Black Cross endured, repurposed by Nazis and video games, while the nuanced truth that faith without fairness fails, that conquest without consent backfires, faded into footnotes. Their ruins still loom over the Baltic, not as monuments to glory, but as tombstones for an empire that forgot why it was built. The knight's ghost whispers a warning across 8 centuries. No walls are high enough to shield you from the consequences of your own choices. The Teutonic Knights defy easy judgment, were they holy warriors or ruthless conquerors, saints or tyrants. Their legacy is a tapestry woven with equal threads of piety and bloodshed, a paradox that challenges modern sensibilities. On one hand, they built hospitals that pioneered medieval medicine, carved orderly towns from wilderness, and created a legal system where even low-born peasants could appeal unjust rulings. Their commanderies became beacons of stability in a fractured Europe, offering safe roads, fair weights in marketplaces, and granaries that fed the hungry. Yet these same hands that bound wounds also burned villages, hanged surrendered prisoners, and waged wars of conversion at sword point. This duality wasn't contradiction. It was the medieval worldview made flesh, where the road to heaven was paved with coerced baptisms, and the love of God could be measured in the width of a battle axe. History offers few clear villains or heroes, and the knights embody this ambiguity. To Baltic pagans, they were devils in white cloaks, erasing cultures under the banner of salvation. To German settlers, they were protectors who turned treacherous forests into prosperous towns. Even their critics couldn't deny their administrative genius. Their state functioned with a bureaucratic precision unmatched until the Renaissance. But efficiency isn't absolution. The question lingers: does building schools excuse burning sacred groves? Can the comfort of ordered streets balance the screams of the conquered? Perhaps the answer lies not in judging them by our standards, but in understanding how seamlessly they blended compassion and cruelty, how fervently they believed their violence served divine grace. Now we turn to you. After this journey through their icy fortresses and fiery campaigns, where do you stand? Were they brutal colonizers masking greed with scripture, or visionaries who dragged a frontier into civilization? And which of their unsolved mysteries begs for a deeper dive? The vanished Amber Room, its golden loot still hidden somewhere beneath Baltic soil. The encrypted Bernsteinkammer ledger that might map their secret stashes. Or the fate of Hans von Köln, the mercenary who vanished with a fortune and became Prussia's most elusive ghost. Drop your verdicts and requests below. History's courtroom is always in session, and every viewer gets a seat on the jury. Until next time, keep questioning, because the past is rarely as simple as black and white, or in this case, black cross on white.